All right, today we are diving into what might be the Apostle Paul's most personal, most raw, and honestly, most human letter he ever wrote. Seriously, this isn't some neat and tidy theological lecture. It reads more like someone's private and pretty painful journal. It's this incredible story about leadership, about spectacular failure, a completely ruined relationship, and the kind of radical grace that somehow, just somehow, holds it all together.
I mean, just listen to this. We're jumping right into the middle of the drama here. Paul isn't writing this from a place of calm reflection. He's in great distress and anguish of heart, and he's writing with many tears. So right away, you know this isn't just a theological disagreement. This is personal. This is a painful conflict, and the stakes could not be any higher.
And that really brings us to the core question that's going to drive this whole explainer. This wasn't some slow, quiet drift apart. No, this was a spectacular, messy collapse. So how did it get this bad? Answering that question is going to take us into a clash of cultures, a huge debate over what a leader should even look like, and maybe one of the most profound ideas Paul ever came up with. So here's our game plan. We're going to start by untangling the really messy backstory of this relationship. Then we'll meet the rivals who showed up on the scene, these so-called super apostles. After that, we'll see Paul's totally radical defense, what I'm calling the upside-down kingdom, see how that applies to something as practical as money, and then get into his bizarre, almost insane strategy of boasting in his own weakness before we land on this powerful idea of treasure and clay jars. Okay, first up, a relationship in ruins. To really get this letter, you have to realize that we're basically walking into the middle of a huge, complicated argument. The letter we call 2 Corinthians, it's really just one chapter in a much longer and much more dramatic story.
Okay, so this timeline is absolutely crucial to understanding the chaos here. I mean, just look at this. Paul starts his church, right? But then things just go completely sideways. First, he writes a letter that we don't even have anymore. Then he writes the letter we know as 1 Corinthians to fix some huge problems. That doesn't work, so he goes in person for what he calls the painful visit, and yeah, it's a total disaster. After that, he writes another severe letter, the tearful letter, which we've also lost. It's only after all that drama, all that history, that he finally writes 2 Corinthians, where he's basically trying to patch things up and defend his entire ministry. You know, it's trying to piece together a group text when half the messages have been deleted. You're missing so much context.
Which brings us to the bad guys in this story. See, the problem wasn't just some internal squabble. It was sparked by a group of brand new leaders who rolled into Corinth. Paul sarcastically calls them the super apostles, and they were, for all intents and purposes, attempting a hostile takeover of the community he had poured his life into.
And the heart of the conflict is right here. The super apostles were everything that Paul wasn't. They were polished, they were eloquent speakers, and they charged a lot of money for their services. They had impressive resumes, probably bragging about their connections back in Jerusalem. And Paul, by his own admission, he was an awkward speaker. He worked with his hands as a laborer to support himself. And his resume? It was a laundry list of persecution, homelessness, and suffering. You have to understand, in the status-obsessed Greco-Roman world, the Corinthians were just deeply embarrassed by this guy.
And this is a really crucial point. We have to get our heads around this honor and shame culture. For us, Paul refusing to take their money seems humble, right? A bonus. But for them, it was a massive insult. In that world, it implied that they weren't worthy of his patronage, that he was above them. His attempt to show love was actually communicating deep disrespect within their cultural framework. He looked like an amateur, and frankly, they were ashamed of him. So, what does Paul do? How does he respond to all this? Does he try to compete? Does he polish up his own resume and try to look more impressive? Nope. He does something way more radical. He basically flips the entire game board over. Welcome to his defense of the upside-down kingdom.
And the key to his entire argument, the thing that unlocks everything, is the paradox of the cross. Paul basically says that the Corinthians' obsession with status and wealth and impressive speeches shows that they've totally misunderstood Jesus. I mean, think about it. For them, power was about conquering, about dominating, about projecting strength. But Jesus' moment of ultimate glory? It wasn't a military victory. It was a humiliating public execution on a cross. The cross reveals a God who doesn't hoard power, but gives it away. It redefines success, not as climbing to the top, but as descending to the bottom to serve.
And this leads us to this really important idea, living a cruciform life. It just means a life that's shaped like the cross. See, Paul's goal isn't to be an impressive leader by the world's standards. His goal is for his entire life and ministry to look like the cross, to be defined by self-giving, sacrificial love that finds its real strength precisely in the moments of weakness and humility.
So, does this actually work in the real world? Well, Paul doesn't just leave it as some abstract idea. He applies this upside-down theology to a super practical and, let's be honest, pretty awkward situation. A fundraising project for the poor that the Corinthians had promised to support and then totally forgot about.
And this is just brilliant. He explains the entire story of the gospel using the language of money. He says, look at Jesus. He was rich. He had all the glory and honor of heaven. But for your sake, he became poor, dying like a common criminal, so that you, who are spiritually broke, could become rich through God's grace. So for Paul, their generosity with money isn't just about a budget line. It's a real-life test of whether the gospel has actually changed their hearts. Okay, now we get to what is, without a doubt, the strangest and most powerful part of the whole letter. Paul is finally backed into a corner. He feels forced to defend his credentials against the super-apostles. So he finally agrees to play their game. He agrees to boast. But the way he does it is, well, it's absolutely shocking.
Get this. In this one letter, Paul uses the Greek word for boasting, kauchiomai, a staggering 29 times. That's more than in all of his other letters combined. You can tell he hates doing it. He even calls himself a fool for it. But he feels like he has no other choice.
But wait a second. If boasting is the language of his opponents, and it goes against everything he believes, then what on earth could he possibly be bragging about? The answer is what makes this letter so revolutionary.
Instead of a list of his greatest hits, Paul gives them a list of his greatest failures, his resume of suffering. He boasts about shipwrecks, beatings, and being thrown in prison. He boasts about sleepless nights, about being hungry and thirsty, about being in constant danger. He even boasts about a mysterious thorn in the flesh, some chronic weakness that he begged God to take away. This would have been absolutely scandalous to his audience. It's like going into a job interview and leading with all the times you got fired.
And this is the theological knockout punch. This is the whole point. Paul finally tells us what Jesus said to him about that thorn in his flesh. Jesus says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Now that word sufficient, the Greek is archeo. It doesn't just mean it's enough to get by. No, it means it's perfectly adequate, it's completely satisfying, it's all you need. And that's the mind-blowing part, right? God's power doesn't just work in spite of our weakness, it's made perfect. It reaches its intended goal through our weakness. So this brings us to the final powerful takeaway from all this. How does this ancient, messy, emotional letter speak to us today in a world that is completely obsessed with personal branding, with polished resumes and showing off a curated, perfect life? Paul uses this incredible metaphor. He says the treasure is the good news about Jesus. But God doesn't put this priceless treasure into some indestructible golden box. He puts it in cheap, fragile, easily cracked jars of clay. That's us. And why would he do that? To show that the all-surpassing power, the light, the glory, it comes from God, not from the container. In fact, it's through the cracks in the jar that the light shines out the brightest. Our weaknesses aren't the problem, they're the whole point. And that's really the challenge of 2 Corinthians for every single one of us. It invites us to completely rethink what strength and success even mean. Maybe the most powerful people aren't the ones who never show weakness, but the ones who are weak enough to let God's strength shine through them so clearly that everyone knows it's not about them at all. So the question it leaves us with is this. Where are the cracks, the failures, the weaknesses in your own jar of clay that you try so hard to hide that might just be the very places where God's light is waiting to shine through?